So this morning we've come to Longabon on the west coast to look at what must be one of the most familiar of all marine animals, which is the hermit crab. So hermit crabs are more shrimp-like than crab-like. Actually, they have a long, soft abdomen, and in order to protect that abdomen, they've taken up the unusual habit of living in the dead shells, the cast-off shells of dead snails or gastropods. Every time the hermit crab molts and grows, it has to change houses. So it's like us, we start off with a little bed set, then we buy an apartment, and then we buy a full-on house. So the hermit crabs start off in tiny little periwinkle shells, and then they might move into a winkle shell, and then eventually they might move into a much larger whelk shell. The smaller of those shells tend to be quite common, but larger dead shells are quite rare. So the animals find it progressively more difficult to find a suitable home.
Is that just because gastropods tend not to live until a ripe old age?
It's just because smaller gastropods are more common than larger gastropods. So there tends to be quite a lot of competition for large shells, and the larger hermit crabs are often living in damaged shells or ones that are in very poor condition.
So lots of bachelor pads, but not many mansions.
Exactly, yeah. So the cheap economic housing is easy to get, but to get a nice mansion on the hill, not so easy. What this actually means is that if you bring in some new shells, then it's quite easy to get them to move from that old shell into a new shell.
So that's why we've got a Tupperware of shells.
So that's why we've come from Cape Town with some city shells, because there's not so many hermits down there. And we've come to Longabon Lagoon, where the sand hermit is absolutely incredibly abundant species here, and there's a huge shortage of shells. And what these hermits tend to do is they follow a very specific behavior pattern. They'll go up to the new shell, and then they usually rotate it with their claws to make sure that it's entire and it doesn't have holes in it, and that also gets any bubbles that are in the coil of the shell out. And then they feel into the shell with their claws and their front legs to make sure there really is nobody in there. And then they align the new shell with the aperture facing them, and then look around to make sure nobody's coming, and then they quickly whip out their tail from the old shell, and within a second whip it around and stick it into the new shell. It's very dangerous for them to be out of the shell, so they do it as quick as they can. The interesting thing here now, though, is the old shell becomes vacant. So very often another even smaller hermit finds that one and moves into that. And you start a whole little chain reaction. Everybody's trading up to the next size of shell. If they can't retract fully into their shell, they're very vulnerable. So you provide them with nice homes, you're doing them a favor. Because they're living inside a shell, even aquatic hermit crabs are fairly resistant to being removed from the water. So I've picked one up from the pool just behind me just to show you what they look like. So this is the typical arrangement here. Then the hermit crab's legs just poke out of the opening of the shell, and then he has one fairly large claw. This one's a very large one and managed to find itself a mansion. Hermits are especially adapted to live in these curled shells. First of all, the abdomen of the animal has to be curled to fit the curvature of the shell, and that actually means that the appendages on the outside of the curve can grow to their full size, but the appendages on the inside of the curve can't. And the legs also have to be adapted. So instead of walking on all four pairs of walking legs, the front pair of legs, like in a crab, has claws, and then legs number 2 and number 3 are used for walking. But legs 4 and legs 5 are greatly reduced and actually folded back inside the shell, and they're used to hang on to the home. So hermit crabs walk only using 2 pairs of legs, completely different from normal crabs that walk using 4 pairs of legs and have 1 pair of nippers. So in some hermit crabs, both the claws are the same size, but in others, the left claw is much larger and the right claw is much smaller. And when the animal gets disturbed, it pulls in the right-hand claw and then closes the door with the left-hand claw. which acts very much like the operculum of the original mollusk that lived into that shell. So it makes an impenetrable, close-fitting, locked door to the shell and keeps the animal nice and safe.
What sort of thing is predating them that they need to have these big doors to defend themselves?
Hermit crabs are crustaceans, so they're like shrimps and lobsters. They're quite tasty, and quite a few different things will prey on them, principally carnivorous fish. So their main predators will be fish, but and also stingrays and octopuses. Any large predator will find a tasty little munchy meal from a hermit crab. Almost all hermit crabs are scavengers, whether they're on rocks or on sandy beaches. They mostly wander around and just look for dead or dying animals or little bits of organic material that they can pick up with their pincers and eat. There are separate males and females, and sometimes you will see the males, which are usually larger, actually grabbing a female who's about to molt and be ready to lay eggs, and actually dragging her around by the corner of her shell. So they like capture the female, and then they keep her captive and drag her around until she actually molts, and then they can mate with her.
Talk about toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
That's a bit hectic.
There are about 50 species in South Africa, and they occur in all different environments. They occur on rocky shores and here on sandy beaches where they're actually particularly abundant. And some of them are even terrestrial. They live out of the water and then only have to go back to the water to breed. They still haven't managed to come up with a way of rearing their young out of the water, but they spend the rest of their life above the high water mark on beaches. Some hermit crabs have some pretty interesting adaptations. Some of the more tropical ones have specialized in only going into cone shells. So cone shells are very hard shells, so that's very beneficial to them, but they have a very long, narrow aperture. So the ordinary hermit wouldn't be able to fit into that little slit-like opening. So the hermit crabs that have specialized on that habitat have become extremely flattened. That's very beneficial for them because it provides a very secure home, and it's very difficult for any sort of predator to pull them out of such a narrow aperture. Some other hermit crabs have set up a relationship, a commensal relationship with sea anemones or zoanthids, which are colonial anemones. At the simplest level, the hermit crab collects an anemone, eases it off the rock, and then puts it on its back on the top of the shell, and it lets it attach there. And this is a mutually beneficial relationship. The stinging cells of the anemone protect the hermit crab, and then when the hermit crab feeds, it tends to kind of tear apart its food, and then those food particles float up in the water and the anemone eats them. In some deeper water hermits, that relationship's been taken even further. When the hermit crab is small, a zoanthid, a little colonial anemone, settles on its shell, and then that zoanthid grows, but it grows beyond the lip of the shell and actually forms a shell out of its own foot, a coiled shell out of its own foot. And that actually means that the hermit crab never has to change shells. Its house actually continually grows with it. And that's extraordinarily beneficial to these hermit crabs because they're living in areas of sand or mud where there are very few shells available. So being able to have a living shell made out of the zoanthid's foot actually means that these hermit crabs can become very abundant, and that wouldn't be the case if they didn't have such a relationship. There are several species that are very common on the rocky shores all around the coast, but in Cape Town we have a particularly red, hairy species which is extremely common under the rocks and in rock pools all around the shores of the Cape Peninsula. So if you see a shell scuttling around quickly, take a closer look at it. It probably has a hermit crab in it. And some of these hermit crabs are extremely beautiful, and they're also great fun to watch, especially if you bring along a couple of extra empty shells and see if you can provide them with a new home. Hey Ben. And that's the story of the hermit. Did you get it?
If you enjoyed watching Explore the Shore, please hit subscribe and follow our Instagram for more.